Okay, let's see. I got a message from a couple of you that the volume was really hard to hear on this, so I'm just going to re-record it. So this is our lecture on Post-Impressionism. You should have already watched the lecture on Impressionism. So to just kind of ground us where we are in art history, we're looking at the late 1800s. So we're in the 1880s, and in the 1880s, Impressionism is gaining public support, and people are starting to accept it. As you recall, it had sort of a rocky start. People didn't really know, like, is this art? We're not used to this kind of style. And since it's gaining public support and people are adjusting to it and accepting it, naturally, artists are kind of over it, okay? Contrary people that we are sometimes. So younger artists at this time in the 1880s in Europe felt that the Impressionists were sacrificing too many important elements of traditional painting. Renoir said at this time, "I have wrung Impressionism dry." So they were kind of looking for what the next thing was going to be in painting. So they start becoming interested in other aspects of painting like line, pattern, and form. Because remember, in Impressionism, they are predominantly focused on light, and particularly how light affects color. So they're also looking at color, but they're looking at color in kind of a different way. This is when we see the emergence of what we call non-local color, meaning representing colors other than those that you are able to observe on the subject of your painting with your eyes. So they're not painting color in a representational sense, but using it expressively or for other purposes divorced from reality. Okay, so we have some pretty big names emerge that you may already be familiar with at this time. So we have Vincent van Gogh. A lot of you on the first day of class said he was one of your favorites, so we're going to talk about Van Gogh. We have Paul Gauguin. Van Gogh and Gauguin are both interested in exploring the expressive potential of artistic elements. Then we have George Serra, and we have Paul Cezanne, and they're a little bit more analytical in their interests. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of those guys and some other people like this artist. This is Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. So he's born in 1864 and he dies in 1901. He's a really interesting figure from history, so let's learn a little bit about him. His work often focuses on the Parisian nightlife. Okay, so he was someone who liked to party. He has sort of a satirical edge that sometimes makes his paintings seem like caricatures a little bit. There's a little bit of a sense of satire or even parody in some of his work. His father and his uncles were all artists, so he comes from kind of a long line of artists. He moves to Paris in 1882. In 1884, he sets up his own studio. And he's a little different because we have a lot of these artists we've been talking about are kind of these starving artists or they're court artists, right? And those are kind of the two things. So he's a little different because he's an aristocrat. So he has aristocratic heritage. He's descended from the Toulouse medieval counts in Western France. But he kind of exiles himself from this hoity-toity, courtly sort of aristocratic life. He was injured when he was a child, and because of the severity of that injury, his growth was stunted. So he was quite short, and he had a lot of pressure, feeling that he didn't quite live up to what the standard of the time of like an aristocratic nobleman was supposed to be like. So he kind of paved his own way and did his own thing. But he did have money because of his heritage. He embraced a kind of bohemian lifestyle in Paris. He hung out with the underclasses, people who were entertainers, people who were sex workers, other people who were kind of social outcasts. And he brought his sketchbook to cafes, to bars, to brothels, to cabarets. He brought his sketchbook with him everywhere and drew the people that he saw. He does also embrace more dangerous aspects of this lifestyle. He develops a drinking problem and he dies of alcoholism at 37, which is really tragic. Okay, let's look at this piece, which is pretty typical of his work. So this is called At the Moulin Rouge. Some of you maybe have seen the movie Moulin Rouge. It's based on the play La Bohème. Anybody? It's a very old reference now. All my references are so old. It was huge when I was younger. It was a big thing. Starring Nicole Kidman. It's kind of a fun movie. It's sad too. Anyway, okay, so let's look at this painting. Here we can definitely see the influence of Degas. For example, we talked about Degas last time. We can also see the influence of Japanese prints and of photography. And we talked about the impact that photography has on painting at this time, last time in the Impressionism lecture. So we want to see what sets this composition apart from more traditional kinds of painting. The composition is asymmetrical, right? So we saw that particularly with Degas. We saw that a little bit with some of the Impressionists. And we have very strong spatial diagonals. We have these strong line patterns, a real emphasis on the linear aspects of the figures. They kind of look like they all have a bold, hard outline around them. We also, though, have this dissonant, non-local color. So if we look at this woman's face in the front, her face looks kind of blue. Generally, human faces are not blue, but we're using this, maybe he's using this as kind of a more expressive kind of quality, okay? He based everything on first-hand observation. So he did, even though he's exploring these hard linear kind of edges, and he's also exploring different uses of line pattern and non-local color, he's still getting his composition from observation. So he's still working from life, from what he sees around him. So he bases everything on first-hand observation. He liked to alter the tone to create moods that differed from the Impressionists. So he's not so much interested in light as he's interested in the more emotional quality, the mood of the setting. He exaggerated forms a little bit, and of course he changed the colors. He creates these kind of distortions by simplifying the figures, particularly simplifying faces. And he foreshadows a little bit later developments in styles like German Expressionism. So a little later, when we get further into modernism, we'll talk about German Expressionism and think back to Toulouse-Lautrec and see if you see the connection there. One of you is writing about his use of lithography for poster art. And if you're studying graphic design at all, I know some of you are taking the graphic design path, he's a really important figure in that realm, so he's someone that you should think about. George Serra. He's born in 1859, he dies in 1891, and he was the son of a customs official. He studied at École des Beaux-Arts, so he studied at the Fine Arts School in Paris, and he's interested in depicting modern life in a strictly intellectual way. He's an artist who is really interested in ideas about color theory particularly, and about how optics in the human eye work. So he creates this painstaking system of painting, which he called divisionism, okay? And it's better known as pointillism. So you maybe did some exercises in your art classes in high school or middle school where you were looking at Serra and doing pointillism. He, like I said, he himself called it divisionism, but it's kind of the same thing. And what he'd do is he would observe color and then he would separate it into its component parts, okay? And then the viewer's eye puts it together and forms the color. So instead of painting violet, he'd paint blue and red right next to each other, and then the color mixes in your eye, okay? That's kind of the basis of what he was interested in. So he applied pure color in tiny little blobs and tiny little dabs to the canvas. Then as you step back, the image emerges. So when you go really close to these, it's just a bunch of little dots, but as you back up, you can see the image. He would have loved those magic eye things that were really popular in the 90s. I don't know if any of you remember this. Ask your parents about magic eye and see if they have an old magic eye book lying around somewhere. Another thing, this is a really old reference now, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is a hilarious movie. You should check it out. In Ferris Bueller, the character Cameron is in the Art Institute of Chicago staring at this particular painting, and it just keeps zooming in and zooming in and zooming in and zooming in. That is this painting, and he's kind of getting sucked into the way it's created with the little dots of pointillism. Serra introduced pointillism and this painting to the French public at the last Impressionist show. So they didn't really have a category in their time for what he was. So he kind of was put in amongst the Impressionists when he first emerged with this, even though it's a very different kind of idea than what they were doing. That was in 1886. Huge crowds were attracted to it. It was a very popular painting. People were really fascinated by it. Le Grand Jatte is an island in the Seine, so it's an island in the middle of the big river that goes through Paris. And the people are a cross-section of the Parisian population in the 1880s. So there's a little girl with her nanny. They're kind of the central figures in this. There's a worker in a sleeveless shirt, like a laborer, like a day laborer. He's kind of in the front smoking a pipe. There's a woman with a monkey on a leash who is probably a sex worker. She's the woman over here. So lots of different kinds of people would gather on nice days on this island. And so he's trying to show this kind of cross-section of the Parisian population, basically, in the late 1800s. Serra, like Monet, was interested in light and color, but his composition is very stiff. Unlike the Impressionists, who were interested in kind of the spontaneity of what light does to color and in capturing the kind of fleeting moment. We talked about that a lot in the Impressionism lecture. Serra is creating a carefully composed piece with rhythmic movement established by repeating motifs. So it's very much more controlled, and he's not interested in capturing this fleeting moment. He's interested in capturing what color can do on like a scientific level kind of in your eye. So this is just a close-up of this canvas so you can see what it looks like really zoomed in. It's pretty interesting. Okay, let's talk about this guy, everybody's favorite artist. Not everybody, but I'd say 90% of my students over the years, when I ask on the first day, who's your favorite artist? If they have one, it's Vincent van Gogh. He's very, very well known, obviously. He's a pretty popular artist. So Vincent van Gogh, he's born in 1853 and he dies in 1890. And he, in many ways, was Serra's opposite. I like showing them back to back because though they're both post-impressionists, they're extremely different in how they think about art and how they produce art. He's interested in distorting color and line for expressive purposes. So rather than this analytical sort of math-based, science-based divisionism stuff, he's purely interested in distorting color and line for expressive purposes. His work feels very emotional. His dad was a pastor, and Vincent also felt a religious calling, but he was not very successful in his missionary work, and he became very depressed because of that. So he went to seek something else, and painting really helped him express his emotions and kind of was a better fit for him than what he originally wanted to pursue, which was a religious path like his dad. He decides, sadly, that he's also an artistic failure at 37, and he fatally shoots himself, which is horrible and very, very tragic and sad. He paints Starry Night in 1889, the year before he dies by suicide. So he's living in an asylum in Saint-Rémy, near Arles, in southern France. He committed himself to this asylum because he suffered from epilepsy, which is a seizure disorder. He was not insane, which is lots of claims out there that he was insane and he had to be locked up in an asylum. He committed himself because he was having epileptic seizures, and at the time people didn't really know how to treat that. Okay, anyway, I just like to clear that up. So he certainly had some mental health issues, but this idea that he was this like raving madman or something is false. That is not accurate. Starry Night is a kind of love letter to the vastness of the universe. So this image is the view from his asylum window near Arles. And people have even matched the exact positioning of the stars to the constellations that he would have seen from his window. So though this obviously is a more expressive and different kind of treatment in terms of color and line, he basically, it was still observation based. So this is the actual view from his window. The stars are in the position they would have been at the time. He's just exaggerating them. So he describes his work as using color to express the self forcibly, which I kind of like that as a thought, like using color to express the self forcefully. So like forcing the emotions onto the canvas via color. The color and the turbulent brushstrokes have been interpreted as signifiers of pervasive depression. So he did have mental health issues. And he wrote to his brother Theo, so we have lots of letters between him and his brother Theo and are able to know a little bit about what was going on in his head. So I'm just going to read you a little excerpt. This is Vincent to Theo. Perhaps death is not the hardest thing in a painter's life. Looking at the stars always makes me dream, as simply as I dream over the black dots representing towns and villages on a map. I ask myself, why shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on France? Just as we take the train to get to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to reach a star. Which is sad, but it's kind of a beautiful sentiment that he felt this connection to the stars and the cosmos, and really felt like his painting was exploring the emotional content of things that he saw around him, including the stars. So it's kind of a pretty sentiment. So anyway, very, very tragic. Vincent van Gogh was not a successful artist during his life, but was highly influential with his peers. So he was not financially successful, but he's very influential with other artists at the time, and he's obviously one of the most famous, well-regarded, and most influential artists still today. This is another painting of his that is just completely different. I feel like everybody knows Starry, Starry Night and some of his other paintings that look like this, and maybe don't know some of his other work. So he had a little bit of a sense of humor about things, and he did small, this is quite a small painting. It's at the Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, where I've been. It's a very interesting collection of work. It's displayed in these very tight corridors, so it's hard to get away from stuff to see it really well, I think. But it's a cool museum. If you're in Amsterdam, check it out. But I just like to show this to show that he made lots of different kinds of work, okay? So he always has these kind of thicker impasto brush strokes, but his work is not all super colorful and swirly like that. Some of it is darker, more somber, but then also he has this kind of little sense of humor with things like sticking the cigarette in the skeleton's mouth. Okay, let's talk about somebody else. Paul Gauguin. So Paul Gauguin is born in 1848 and he dies in 1903. He was a stockbroker. You know that path where you're a stockbroker and then you go on to become a very famous artist. So he's a stockbroker in Paris, but he hated his job. He really, really hated it. He was not happy. So he decided to try his hand at being a painter instead. He moved to Pont-Aven, which was is kind of like an artist colony in Brittany, so in a different part of France, away from Paris, away from the big city. He goes and moves to this area where there's other artists, and he starts painting there. And Gauguin's style is influenced by his admiration of Japanese prints, by cloisonné technique, and by stained glass. So he was very interested in the way these more severe kind of media treated color and shape. Okay, so like cloisonné is a jewelry kind of technique where you have little bitty pieces of colorful glass or clay set next to each other to create an image. It's kind of similar to stained glass, except it isn't quite so rectilinear as stained glass. So he's very interested in this idea of color and shape and how that could maybe be translated into painting. He wanted to transform traditional paintings into abstract expressive patterns. So again, this interest in pattern and an interest in abstraction and abstraction of color that isn't related to light or reality, which we call non-local color. He and Van Gogh actually shared a studio briefly in 1888, but they disagreed about basically everything and argued constantly, so it didn't work out. One thing they disagreed about was whether artists should paint from life or from memory. So Gauguin argued that subjective expression gave the artist power to control color and composition, and to not be limited by observation. So Gauguin is team paint from memory because it can then be more expressive because it's being filtered through your mind and your memory and you're not restricted by observation. Whereas Van Gogh, as we saw with Starry Night, which is literally the view from his window, was interested in painting from observation, but distorting that by distorting the color and the line and texture. Okay, so in 1888, Gauguin moves to Tahiti. He wanted to live far from the materialistic Europe. He wanted to reconnect with nature. He was very disappointed because he gets to Tahiti and its capital, Papeete, was full of French imports and was dangerous, and it had been extensively colonized. So he got there and he was expecting this like wild paradise that was the opposite of Paris, and he gets there and there's lots of French people everywhere. So he then moves out of the capital into the Tahitian countryside. He is happier once he's there. He likes that better. He chose his color palette based on the tropical flora of the island. So he looked at all the tropical vegetation and flowers and fruits and things and based his color palette on that. His work was not well received, and he poisoned himself. So he's quite dramatic. He tries to kill himself. He poisons himself. But first he paints this painting. He is not successful in his suicide attempt, which is good, obviously. He thought this was his most important work, and this one is called Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? So kind of the big questions in life, right? And it's a sobering and sort of pessimistic look at the life cycle. So at the right side of the image, we have the beginning. We have this infant, this little baby over here, right? And then at the center, we have a Polynesian Eve at the prime of her life, picking fruit from a tree. So she's the woman in the center that's reaching up and picking that fruit. She's supposed to represent Eve. And at the left, we have this Tahitian idol in the background. And then at the left, we have this old woman, right, at the extreme left. And she's crouching down and is kind of contemplating death. So she's like a crone like this. So we have the baby, we have prime of life, and then we have the crone. Okay, and he writes about this painting in 2 letters to friends in which he also talks about killing himself. And he writes extensively about it and how he is depressed by the passing of time and life. But in that same letter, he writes about his discoveries in terms of technical painting treatments, how he's very pleased that he's getting the color to look the way he wants, and he's very pleased that he's achieved this kind of flatness. So he was very interested in getting this flat kind of shape and color focused look to his work, and he did feel he was successful in that. So that is good. All right, let's look at somebody else. Paul Cezanne. Paul Cezanne is oftentimes described as an impressionist. I put him with the post-impressionists. It's important to note that none of this is linear, right? So it's not like impressionism goes from here to here, and then post-impressionism from here to here. Everything's kind of happening, overlapping at the same time. So Cezanne is someone who influenced the impressionists and the post-impressionists, and he kind of has a foot in both camps and also outside. He also influences Cubism. He's a very important, very influential artist. He's born in 1839. He dies in 1906. And he's from southern France. He was trained as a painter. He was classically trained as a painter. And he was an impressionist. And then after his work with light, he was very interested in light and how it affects color and capturing those moments where everything changes from one painting to another, one time period to another. He basically moves on to other experiments after he feels like he's gotten what he can out of that. He decided that Impressionism lacked form and structure, which is kind of interesting, sort of like Serra a little bit, and that Serra creates divisionism because he's imposing his own kind of structure and form on there. So Cezanne decides he wants to make Impressionism something solid and enduring, like the work in the museum. And that's a direct quote from him. After studying the masterworks at the Louvre, he's like, okay, Impressionism doesn't have enough structure. It's based on these fleeting moments. We have to have something more based in form that will last. So he does a lot of landscape paintings, but his still life work was what really worked for his idea of fixing impressionistic techniques to something solid rather than fleeting or transitory. So he wanted to take these ideas that he developed along with the other impressionists and put them on something stationary and indoors where he had more control of it to really like work out those ideas. So he captures the solidity of each object by layering patches of color. So he's layering up these patches of color on top of each other. His paint is pretty thick, not quite like Van Gogh. Van Gogh has very, very thick paint, but he's layering each color to achieve these very precise, very deep, kind of nuanced layered colors. Some objects are also depicted from different vantage points simultaneously, which is something that's foreshadowing the development of Cubism. So we'll talk about Baroque and Picasso when we talk about Cubism, and they were extremely influenced by Cezanne and talk about Cezanne a lot in their development of Cubism. So we can see his legacy in Cubism, and there's even links to it more directly in his later works like Bathers. So this is he did a whole series of works about bathers. This is the largest one of those paintings, so it's called Large Bathers, and that the painting is large, not the bathers. And in this, we can see even more foreshadowing of Cubism, the way he's flattening the background, middle ground, and foreground. He's interested in some of the same things as Gauguin in terms of flattening the representation to the picture plane. He's also still interested in these ideas about color, but he's also showing people some more from above, some more from below, some more from straight on, all in one picture plane. So this is pretty revolutionary work. Okay, hopefully this one is easier to hear than the last one. All right.